1900 family portrait found. Curator reveals a shocking and unsettling discovery. Dr. Elizabeth Carter had worked as a curator of photography at the Charleston Historical Society for nearly 2 decades, but she had never experienced a moment quite like this one. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when she first examined the photograph that would consume her thoughts for the next 8 months and unravel a family secret that had been hidden for over a century. The photograph had arrived as part of an estate donation from the family of Margaret Whitmore, a prominent Charleston socialite who had passed away at the age of 96. Her granddaughter Susan had contacted the museum to donate her grandmother's extensive collection of family photographs and documents, believing they might have historical value for the Society's archives. Elizabeth had been cataloging the collection methodically when she came across a particularly striking portrait. The photograph, dated 1900 based on the studio mark and clothing styles, showed what appeared to be a prosperous white family posed in an elegant Victorian parlor. The image was remarkably well preserved, the sepia tones still rich and the details crisp despite the passage of 124 years. The family consisted of 4 people positioned in the formal manner typical of turn-of-the-century photography. A distinguished gentleman in his 50s sat in an ornate chair, his expression stern and authoritative. Standing beside him was a woman of similar age, her hand resting on his shoulder, her face composed, but with eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. 2 young women, perhaps in their early 20s, stood on either side. Daughters, clearly, given the family resemblance. Elizabeth made her initial notes and was about to move on when something caught her eye. A subtle irregularity in the photograph's background, near the heavy velvet curtains that framed the left side of the composition. It was nothing more than a slight variation in the shadows, a barely perceptible difference in tone that most people would never notice. She pulled out her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The shadow seemed oddly shaped, not quite consistent with the natural fall of light in the room. Under intense magnification, the truth became undeniable. There was a 5th person in this family portrait, someone who had been carefully positioned to be almost invisible, hidden in the shadows but not completely erased from the image. Based on the size and proportions, it appeared to be an infant, wrapped in white fabric, held in someone's arms just beyond the reach of the photographer's primary lighting. Elizabeth sat back, her mind racing. Why would a family include someone in their formal portrait but deliberately hide them in shadows? The mother's sadness now seemed more profound, more personal. The daughters' faces looked strained, as if holding themselves rigidly composed against deep emotion, and the father's stern expression seemed less like patriarchal authority and more like determined control. She reached for her phone to call Susan. This discovery needed immediate discussion. Susan Whitmore arrived at the Charleston Historical Society the following morning, curiosity evident in the way she rushed through the museum's entrance directly to Elizabeth's office. Elizabeth had prepared the photograph on her desk, along with several enlarged details showing the shadowed figure more clearly. "Dr. Carter, your message said you found something unusual in one of Grandmother's photographs?" Susan asked as she entered, slightly breathless. "Please sit down," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the chair. "I want to show you something and get your honest reaction. Look at this photograph carefully. What do you see?" Susan studied the image, her brow furrowing. "That's the Whitmore family. My great-great-grandparents, Richard and Catherine, and their daughters, Eleanor and Grace. I've seen this photograph before. Grandmother had a copy in her bedroom. She said it was one of the few formal portraits the family had from that era." "Look more carefully," Elizabeth encouraged, pointing to the shadowed area. "Look at the background, particularly here on the left side." Susan leaned forward, squinting. For a moment, she saw nothing unusual. Then her expression changed, her eyes widening as the outline became visible. Is there someone else in the photograph?" she whispered. "I believe so," Elizabeth confirmed. "There appears to be a 5th person, an infant, I think, positioned in the shadows. They were deliberately kept out of the primary lighting, but they're definitely there." Susan stared for a long moment, her face pale. "I don't understand. Why would someone be hidden like that? Who could it be?" "That's what I hoped you might help me discover," Elizabeth said gently. "Did your grandmother ever mention anything about the family history from this period? Anything unusual about 1900? Or about Eleanor and Grace?" Susan shook her head slowly. "Not that I remember. Grandmother talked about the Whitmores being an old Charleston family, quite prominent in society. But she never mentioned anything like this." She paused, then added quietly, "Though there were always gaps in her stories. Periods she wouldn't discuss. I assumed it was just because records were lost or she didn't know much about certain relatives. Elizabeth pulled out a notepad. Tell me what you do know about the people in this photograph. Let's start with the basics and see if we can find any clues. Susan took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. Richard Whitmore was my great-great-grandfather. He owned a shipping company, quite successful. Catherine was his wife, from another prominent Charleston family. Eleanor was the eldest daughter, born around 1878, I think. Grace was younger by about 2 years. What happened to Eleanor and Grace? Did they marry? Have families? Grace married well, a banker from Savannah, had 4 children. Her line continued. Susan hesitated. But Eleanor, grandmother always became vague when I asked about her. She said Eleanor lived a quiet life, never married, died young. That's all I ever learned. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. An unmarried daughter who died young, whose life story was deliberately obscured. This was exactly the pattern that often concealed illegitimate births in Victorian society. Elizabeth spent the following week immersed in research, starting with Charleston's public records from the turn of the century. Birth records, death certificates, census data, society pages from old newspapers, anything that might reveal information about Eleanor Whitmore and explain the hidden infant in the photograph. The basic facts were easy to establish. Eleanor Whitmore, born May 1878, was indeed the eldest daughter of Richard and Catherine. She appeared in the 1880 and 1890 census records living at the family home on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses. Society pages from the Charleston News and Courier mentioned her occasionally at social events through the late 1890s. But then, abruptly, the mentions stopped. Elizabeth found no record of Eleanor in Charleston society pages after early 1899. And more significantly, she found Eleanor's death certificate. Died March 1901, age 22. Cause of death listed as consumption, tuberculosis, the Victorian era's convenient explanation for many deaths, particularly young women whose real circumstances families wanted to conceal. Elizabeth pulled out the 1900 census and found the Whitmore household. Richard, Catherine, and Grace were all listed, but Eleanor was not there. According to the census, taken in June 1900, Eleanor Whitmore did not reside at the family home. Where had she been? Elizabeth expanded her search, looking through records of hospitals, sanitariums, and charitable institutions. It was tedious work, scanning through handwritten ledgers and poorly indexed documents. But finally, she found it. Eleanor Whitmore's name in the registry of the Magnolia Grove Home for Unwed Mothers, a private institution that had operated on the outskirts of Charleston from 1885 to 1920. According to the registry, Eleanor had been admitted in January 1900 and had given birth to a male infant on April 3, 1900. The child's name was listed simply as Baby Whitmore, and in the column marked Disposition, someone had written in careful script, Adopted. Record sealed per family request. Elizabeth sat back, her heart pounding. Here was the answer. Eleanor had been pregnant, sent away to hide the scandal, and forced to give up her child. The photograph must have been taken shortly before or after the birth, a final family portrait that included the child Eleanor would never be allowed to claim, hidden in shadows to preserve the family's reputation while still acknowledging his existence. But who was the father? And what had happened to Eleanor after giving up her child? The death certificate said she died less than a year later. Had it truly been tuberculosis, or had the trauma of losing her child contributed to her death? Elizabeth needed to find more. She requested access to the sealed adoption records, knowing it would require special permission and legal justification. While she waited for approval, she turned her attention to newspapers, looking for any mention of Eleanor's death or funeral. The Charleston News and Courier's archives from March 1901 contained a brief obituary notice for Eleanor Whitmore. It was formal and sparse, revealing almost nothing. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, beloved daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Whitmore, passed away peacefully on March 12, 1901, after a brief illness. Funeral services were held privately. The family requests no visitors during this time of mourning. The wording was telling. Brief illness contradicted the death certificate's claim of consumption, which was typically a prolonged disease. Funeral services were held privately, suggested the family wanted to avoid public scrutiny. And no visitors was highly unusual for a prominent Charleston family, whose social standing normally demanded elaborate public mourning rituals. Elizabeth searched for additional context in the weeks surrounding Eleanor's death. What she found was unexpected, Buried in the society pages from late March 1901 was a small announcement that the Whitmore family had temporarily relocated to their summer residence and would not be receiving callers for the season. A prominent family suddenly leaving Charleston immediately after their daughter's death, avoiding all social contact. This spoke of shame and scandal, not grief. Elizabeth continued searching and found something even more intriguing. A brief item from the Charleston Evening Post dated April 1900, just weeks after the photograph would have been taken. Mr. Richard Whitmore has announced the establishment of a charitable fund for the benefit of the Magnolia Grove Home for Unwed Mothers. The generous donation will provide for the care and rehabilitation of unfortunate young women who find themselves in difficult circumstances. The timing was too coincidental. Richard Whitmore had made a substantial donation to the very institution where his daughter had given birth, likely as part of an arrangement to ensure the adoption was handled discreetly and that the institution's staff would maintain absolute confidentiality about Eleanor's situation. Elizabeth found one more crucial piece of information. A property record showing that in May 1900, Richard Whitmore had purchased a small house on the outskirts of Charleston, in a modest neighborhood far from the family's social circle. The property had been held in trust for exactly 11 months before being sold in March 1901, the same month Eleanor died. Had Eleanor been living in that house after giving birth? Had she been hidden away from society, separated from her family and her child, isolated in her grief and shame? Elizabeth needed to find out what had happened in that house, and she needed to discover the fate of the infant hidden in the photograph's shadows. Elizabeth drove to the address listed in the property records, curious to see if the house still stood. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the past 124 years. Modest, early 1900s homes had been replaced by modern developments, and the area that had once been on Charleston's outskirts was now fully incorporated into the city. But remarkably, the house was still there. It was small and weathered, clearly dating from the turn of the century, with a sagging porch and peeling paint. A "for sale" sign stood in the overgrown front yard, and Elizabeth noticed a lockbox on the door. It was vacant. She called the real estate agent listed on the sign and arranged an immediate viewing, introducing herself as a historian interested in the property's history. The agent, eager for any potential interest in a house that had languished on the market, met her there within an hour. "It's been empty for about 6 months," the agent explained as she unlocked the door. "The previous owner was an elderly woman who passed away. No heirs came forward, so the property went to the state and is being sold to settle the estate. It needs a lot of work, as you can see." Elizabeth stepped inside, and despite the decay and neglect, she could still sense the bones of the original structure. The main room was small but had once been elegantly appointed, with crown molding and a fireplace. A narrow staircase led to a second floor. "Do you know anything about the house's history?" Elizabeth asked. The agent shrugged. "Not much. It's been through several owners over the years. But there's a bunch of old stuff in the attic that nobody's bothered to clear out yet. You're welcome to look if you're interested in the history." Elizabeth's heart leaped. "May I?" The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with boxes of miscellaneous items left behind by various occupants over the decades. Elizabeth began carefully sorting through them, looking for anything from the early 1900s. In the back corner, beneath a pile of more recent belongings, she found an old trunk covered in dust and cobwebs. The lock had rusted through, and she was able to open it with minimal effort. Inside were personal items from another era, clothing from the turn of the century, books, letters, and a leather journal. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened the journal carefully. On the first page, written in elegant script, was a name: Eleanor Whitmore. She had found Eleanor's private writings, documents that had somehow remained in this house for over a century, forgotten and undiscovered until now. Elizabeth carefully photographed each page of Eleanor's journal before removing it from the house, wanting to ensure she had a complete record, even if something happened to the fragile original. Back in her office at the Charleston Historical Society, she began reading Eleanor's words, feeling as though she were reaching across more than a century to hear a voice that had been deliberately silenced. The journal began in January 1900, the month Eleanor had been sent to Magnolia Grove. "Father says I have brought shame upon the family," Eleanor had written in a shaky hand. "Mother cannot look at me without weeping. Grace avoids me entirely, as if my condition might be contagious. They are sending me away tomorrow, to a place where women like me, fallen women, as they call us, are hidden from decent society until our mistakes can be corrected." Elizabeth felt tears prickling her eyes at Eleanor's pain. She continued reading. I do not feel fallen. I feel betrayed. James promised me we would marry. He said his family would accept me despite the difference in our circumstances. He said love was more important than social position. I believed him. And when I told him I was carrying his child, he looked at me as if I were a stranger. Worse, as if I were something unclean. He said I must have been mistaken about his intentions. He said he could not possibly marry someone who had been so forward as to compromise herself before marriage. Then he left Charleston, and I learned he had already been engaged to another girl, someone his family had chosen for him. So Eleanor had been seduced and abandoned by a young man who had never intended to marry her. It was a story as old as time, but no less devastating for its familiarity. The journal entries from Eleanor's time at Magnolia Grove were heartbreaking. She wrote about the other women there, their stories of coercion, abandonment, and family rejection. She wrote about the stern matrons who ran the home, who treated the residents with cold efficiency rather than compassion. And she wrote about her growing attachment to the child she was carrying, even as she knew she would not be allowed to keep him. April 3, 1900. My son was born today. They let me hold him for only a few minutes before taking him away. He has dark hair and eyes like mine. I counted his fingers and toes, all perfect. I kissed his forehead and whispered that I loved him, that I would always love him, that I was sorry for the life he would have without his mother. Then the matron took him from my arms. I do not know if I will ever see him again. Elizabeth had to pause, overcome with emotion. The infant in the shadowed photograph had been Eleanor's son, captured in that brief moment before he was taken from her forever. The journal continued through Eleanor's forced convalescence at Magnolia Grove, and then her move to the small house her father had purchased. May 1900. Father has arranged for me to live here, away from society. He says I may not return home until sufficient time has passed that no one will remember the timing of my absence. He visits once a week, bringing money for household expenses, but never staying long. He will not speak my son's name. He will not tell me who adopted him or where he has gone. Elizabeth continued reading Eleanor's journal, each entry revealing more of the young woman's isolation and grief. But it was an entry from June 1900 that made Elizabeth's breath catch. June 15, 1900. Something extraordinary happened today. Mother came to visit, alone, the first time she has come without father. She brought Grace, and, miraculously, she brought my son. She said she had convinced father that we should have one family portrait before the baby was sent away permanently to his new family. She said she could not bear the thought of having no image of him, no proof that he had ever existed. Elizabeth flipped back to the photograph, understanding now crystallizing. Catherine Whitmore, Eleanor's mother, had orchestrated the photograph, not as a family portrait celebrating their status, but as a secret memorial to a grandchild who would be erased from the family history. Eleanor's journal continued. We went to Morrison's studio. Father was stiff and angry throughout, but Mother had insisted, and he could not refuse her without causing a scene. I held my son in the shadows at the back of the room, where the photographer's lights barely reached. Mr. Morrison understood without being told that this arrangement was deliberate. He positioned everyone carefully, ensuring that I and the baby were present in the photograph but nearly invisible. Grace looked at me only once, and I saw pity in her eyes. When it was finished, Father said this would be the last time, that the child would be sent to his adopted family within the week, and that I was never to speak of him again. So the photograph had been Catherine's doing, a mother's desperate attempt to preserve some memory of her grandson, even if only as a shadow in a formal portrait. And Eleanor had been there too, hidden in the darkness, holding her son for what she believed would be the last time. But Eleanor's journal revealed something even more significant. Several pages later, dated July 1900, she had written, I have discovered where my son is, Mrs. Patterson, one of the women I met at Magnolia Grove, has connections with the adoption agencies. She made inquiries for me and learned that father arranged for the child to be adopted by a family named Richardson, who live in the countryside north of Charleston. They are simple people, farmers, I believe, but Mrs. Patterson says they are kind and desperately wanted a child. At least I know he will be loved, even if not by me. Elizabeth immediately began searching for Richardson families in rural areas north of Charleston in 1900. It was a common enough name that dozens appeared in census records, but she narrowed the search by looking for couples who would have been of childbearing age with no children listed in previous census years. She found several possibilities, but one stood out. Thomas and Mary Richardson, living near Monk's Corner, listed in the 1900 census with an infant son named William, born approximately April 1900. No birth certificate existed for William Richardson, which made sense if he had been born as Baby Whitmore and his records sealed. Elizabeth's investigation was beginning to reveal not just the identity of the child in the photograph, but the possibility that his descendants might still exist, unaware of their connection to the prominent Whitmore family. Elizabeth worked with a professional genealogist to trace the Richardson family line forward from 1900. It was painstaking work, following William Richardson through census records, marriage certificates, birth records of his own children, and eventually his death certificate from 1967. William Richardson had lived his entire life near Monk's Corner, had married a local woman named Sarah in 1922, and had 3 children. He had worked as a farmer and then as a mechanic, living a modest but apparently stable life. According to his death certificate, he had passed away at age 67, survived by his 3 children and numerous grandchildren. The genealogist traced William's descendants to the present day. His youngest daughter, Martha, was still living, now 89 years old, residing in a nursing home in Somerville, just outside Charleston. And Martha had children and grandchildren of her own, several of whom still lived in the Charleston area. Elizabeth knew she needed to approach this situation with extreme sensitivity. These people had no idea of their connection to the Whitmore family, no knowledge that their grandfather had been born to a young woman forced to give him up, no awareness that they were descended from one of Charleston's most prominent families. She decided to start by contacting Martha's grandson, David Richardson, who, according to public records, was a high school teacher living in Mount Pleasant. Elizabeth called him and explained that she was researching a historical photograph and believed his family might have a connection to it. She asked if he would be willing to meet and look at some documents. David agreed, curious but cautious. They met at a coffee shop the following afternoon. Elizabeth brought copies of the photograph and carefully selected excerpts from Eleanor's journal, enough to tell the story without overwhelming him with the full emotional weight of what she had discovered. "Mr. Richardson, I want to show you something, but first I need to ask, what do you know about your grandfather William's early life? About his birth and his parents?" David frowned thoughtfully. "Not much, honestly. Grandpa William was raised by Thomas and Mary Richardson. They were my great-great-grandparents. I always assumed they were his biological parents, but now that you ask, I realize I've never seen any baby pictures of him or heard stories about his birth. And my grandmother Martha once mentioned something about him being chosen by God to be their son, which I thought was just a religious way of speaking, but maybe..." "Mr. Richardson," Elizabeth said gently, "I believe your grandfather was adopted, and I believe I've found information about his birth mother." She slid the photograph across the table, pointing to the shadowed figure. "This is her, holding your grandfather just days after he was born." David stared at the photograph for a long time, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder to something like grief. Elizabeth gave him space to process, waiting until he was ready to speak. "You're telling me my grandfather was born to this family?" he finally asked, gesturing to the clearly visible Whitmores in the photograph. "To this wealthy Charleston family, and he was given away." "Not given away voluntarily," Elizabeth said gently. She explained what she had learned about Eleanor, about the pregnancy and the forced separation, about the social pressures that had made it impossible for Eleanor to keep her son. She showed him excerpts from Eleanor's journal, watching as tears filled his eyes when he read Eleanor's words about holding her newborn son and being forced to give him up. "She loved him," David whispered. "She wanted to keep him." "Very much," Elizabeth confirmed. "And his grandmother, Catherine Whitmore, loved him too. That's why this photograph exists. It was her way of ensuring he wasn't completely erased from the family history, even if he had to be hidden in shadows." David was quiet for several minutes, absorbing this information. Finally, he asked, "What happened to Eleanor? To his birth mother?" Elizabeth hesitated, then decided he deserved the truth. She died in March 1901, less than a year after giving birth. The death certificate says consumption, but her journal suggests she died of a broken heart. She never recovered from losing her son. David wiped his eyes. "God, that's devastating. My grandfather never knew any of this?" "I don't believe so. Adoption records were sealed, and it seems the Richardson family never told him he was adopted. It's possible they didn't even know about Eleanor or the Whitmores. The adoption may have been arranged through intermediaries to protect the family's identity." "Does the Whitmore family know about this?" David asked. "About my grandfather and his descendants?" "I've been working with Susan Whitmore. Eleanor's great-great-grandniece. She knew nothing about Eleanor having a child until I discovered this photograph. I wanted to speak with you before telling her that I'd found Eleanor's son's descendants. How you proceed with this information is entirely your choice." David looked at the photograph again, studying Eleanor's barely visible figure holding the infant who would become his grandfather. "I think I'd like to meet her," he said finally. "Susan, I mean. We're family, even if neither of our families knew it until now. And I think my grandmother Martha should know this story. She's old, but she's sharp. She deserves to know the truth about her father's birth." Elizabeth felt relief wash over her. "I'll arrange a meeting. And David, there's one more thing. I'd like to feature this photograph and the story behind it in an exhibition at the Charleston Historical Society. It's an important piece of history, revealing the hidden costs of Victorian social conventions and the lives damaged by shame and secrecy. But I won't proceed without your family's permission and the Whitmore's agreement." "I think it should be told," David said firmly. "These secrets have been kept long enough." 3 months later, the Charleston Historical Society opened its new exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight: The Untold Stories in Victorian Photographs. The centerpiece was the 1900 Whitmore family portrait, now displayed with full explanation of the shadowed figure and the story it represented. Beside the photograph hung enlargements showing Eleanor in the shadows, detailed analysis of the photographic techniques used to deliberately obscure her presence, and excerpts from her journal. A family tree showed the connection between Eleanor and the Richardson family, bringing together two branches that had been separated by social convention and secrecy. At the exhibition opening, two families stood together before the photograph: Susan Whitmore representing the Whitmore descendants, and David Richardson with several members of his family, including his grandmother Martha, who had insisted on attending despite her age. Martha sat in her wheelchair, studying the photograph with tears streaming down her face. "That's my father she's holding," she whispered. "My father who I loved so much, who was the kindest man I ever knew. And this young woman who I never knew existed, she gave him life and then had to give him away." Susan stood beside her, also crying. "She was my great-great-aunt. I never knew she existed either. My family kept her secret for over a century, and in doing so, we lost not just her story, but the knowledge of all of you, our family." The two women clasped hands, bridging the gap created by shame and silence more than 100 years earlier. Elizabeth watched from the side of the room as visitors moved through the exhibition, reading Eleanor's words, learning about the practice of hiding illegitimate children through adoption and family separation, discovering how many Victorian photographs might contain similar hidden stories. A young woman approached her, a college student based on her backpack and age. "This is incredible," the student said. "I had no idea that photographs could hide stories like this. It makes me wonder how many other family portraits have shadows we've never really looked at." "Probably more than we know," Elizabeth replied. "Photography was supposed to capture truth, but it was also used to create acceptable fictions, to show what families wanted the world to see while hiding what they considered shameful. This photograph is unusual because it tried to do both, to maintain the fiction of a respectable family while also preserving evidence of the truth." The exhibition ran for 6 months and attracted considerable attention, including coverage in historical journals and mainstream media outlets. But for Elizabeth, the most meaningful outcome was watching the Richardson and Whitmore families form connections, with David's children meeting Susan's grandchildren and discovering they were cousins, separated by generations of secrecy, but now reunited. On the final day of the exhibition, Susan and Martha met one more time before the photograph. Martha was frailer now, but her mind remained clear. "I think Eleanor would be happy," Martha said softly, looking at the shadowed figure of the young woman who had been her father's birth mother. "She loved him enough to let him go so he could have a better life, and she loved him enough to insist on being in this photograph even if she had to hide. She made sure he wasn't completely forgotten, and now, finally, she's not forgotten either." Susan squeezed Martha's hand gently. "The baby in the shadows has a name now, William Richardson, and the woman holding him has her story back, Eleanor Whitmore, who loved her son but wasn't allowed to keep him. They're both part of history now, together." Elizabeth carefully packed the photograph away in its archival storage, but she knew its impact would continue. The image that had seemed like a simple Victorian family portrait had revealed itself to be something far more complex, a document of love and loss, of secrecy and survival, of the ways families hide their truths and sometimes preserve them simultaneously. One photograph, 4 visible people and 1 hidden in shadows, and a story that had waited 124 years to finally be told, bringing 2 families together and ensuring that Eleanor Whitmore and her son would never be forgotten again. The shadows had been brought into the light at last,